Kung Fu Panda 2 in 3D. One of the main problems with old-time 3D is if the stereo is too extreme, the background will compete for attention with the foreground. Notice for this feather poke how they make the background nearly completely flat. Actually, I think it is flat. Impossible to do with a 3D camera, but it allows the eye to focus on the extruding feather. And you will see that frequently in this movie. Here, when we go on a run, the fast-moving background is again reduced to flat with only the characters in stereo. It's actually a very artful use of 3D that considers the environment, the moment's intent, and limitations of what people are even capable of processing at such a high-speed moment. With that in mind, a lot of the 3D in this movie really only works in the context of motion. There are many, many moments that do not work as a stereo still image. Notice this shot looking high up, giving us a kind of tunnel view. And the hanging lanterns really sell the moment, but the depth fades out in a very unrealistic way. It goes from a slightly hyper stereo in the foreground to mere pixels of discrepancy once we approach the middle of the area. If you stare at it for any length of time, the perspective feels very, very off. But you don't stare at it. The camera pans up and we move on. Again, it's a movie, not a gallery, so it has a way of working. It's a creative use of 3D. In the same way that light is positioned to create highlights, we see the stereo manipulated as if it were a spotlight to highlight various types of action. This feels like a movie made to be seen in 3D, and it represents a time when movies, especially animations, were figuring out the best way to incorporate this newly refreshed medium. I suppose this was the first Kung Fu Panda movie to be released theatrically in 3D stereo. We get some brief flashbacks to the first movie, which are all shown flat. Although there was a 3D edition of that first movie released this same year, perhaps it wasn't ready in time to be incorporated. The first movie makes for an interesting comparison to this one. In many ways, it offers a more comprehensive stereo experience. There are no flat backgrounds used in part one, but it also doesn't really come at you like the sequel does. Here in the sequel, notice the bubbles floating in front of us and the room behind it only being given at best a tacit representation of 3D. We are purposely placed in the bubbles. We are not dazzled by the dishes or the cook stove. We are playing with the bubbles. We are focused front and center. It's commanding our attention. In the conversion of the first one, there's nothing like that. Everything is given a solid geometry, and although delightful, it doesn't really highlight anything, so you'll often be looking at things that don't inform the story. 3D is a distracting medium, which is great for establishing introductory moments, such as when we enter the chamber of this palace and are tickled by wonderful stereo reflections coming off the floor and a commanding array of pillars showing us the majesty of this place. It's polished, it's rich, and my eyes dance around the room to try and take it all in. But once the bird steps up to speak, the stereo is really only front and center, and my eyes are glued on who we're speaking with. Here we are introduced to a busy restaurant with great depth, showing the party flags and crowds in the distance, and the eyes rolls over to try and take it all in. But once faces are on screen, we need to pay attention and follow the story, and that's usually where you'll find the depth in the background disappearing. So although you might describe the 3D as somewhat of a mixed bag, it's actually a great demonstration of a movie using stereo instead of merely being in stereo. Likewise, the story does something similar, which fascinated me. You might say the theme is kept flat and undeveloped, which curiously helped focus on the action and hijinks. It made it a better cartoon. This action still needed a little heart to give it some meaning, but just the most subtle presence of emotion was enough to create an illusion that there existed a much deeper meaning to it all. The emotions are shallow, and what I mean by that is the journey was arbitrary. Panda feels this, and then Panda is feeling that, with the only bridge between the two being time left in the movie. And again, that feels like a criticism, but it was an effective choice, and it left me wondering how it could even work. If I were writing this movie, I would have made the error of writing in a bunch of stuff to show Panda working it out in his head and just showing him take little thought steps to try and get from point A to point B, which would have been unnecessary. It would have muddied this movie right down, if not completely destroyed the experience. And on reflection, I wonder if that's because this cartoon journey is actually closer to life than some highbrow brooding dramas I've enjoyed over the years. It dawned on me that in real life, changing your thinking doesn't really have an arc. Mulling something over and over for days, weeks, or years is actually not changing. It's just replaying memories that are compatible with the current emotion. It's making things complicated to justify not changing. Thinking is actually quite circular. It goes nowhere. And I think we enjoy that because change is scary. It's a kind of death. And if I feel something for long enough, I start to think that that is me. So naturally, I'm going to try and protect it. And change really only happens in life when I grow exhausted or bored of feeling the same old fire. And out of that void, a new emotion emerges, which thoughts start to chase after, like a dog getting a new toy. And although this change can be profound, there's really is nothing to it. It could have happened at any time. And that's what we see here. This is happening because Panda feels this way. Now, this different thing is happening because he now feels a different way. And it's just fascinating that it can be just that simple.